Welcome into the second floor of the Duncan Student Center as football is back. The Fighting Irish took home a big 35-17 win over Louisville in week one. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it was better than the last game the Irish played in 2019, but I mean, a win's a win. Wasn't pretty, but we got it done, so.
1 down, 11 to go.
All right, Shamrock Sports is next.
Hello, I'm Father John Jenkins, President of the University of Notre Dame, and thank you for watching Shamrock Sports.
Sounds like
Come back inside the second floor of the Duncan Student Center. Austin Rooney alongside Ellen Geyer and David Korzeniowski. We're glad to have you with us. And let's jump into that game against Louisville. It was a slow start for the Irish. The defense didn't perform off the bat.
Yeah, I thought that it was a pretty typical opener, right? The team looked good. They really separated in the second half, but shaking the rust off a little bit, sort of seeing how this team comes together. I was impressed overall. Book really stepped up in that second half, but I like the defense. I mean, they did let up a couple touchdowns, but Louisville had a lot more speed than I think Notre Dame was anticipating.
Yeah, and I think just generally the way that Louisville came out was not at all what Notre Dame was expecting. Right. Obviously, after a 2-10 season last year, you think it's an easy game, not a trap in any way. And I'm not saying that it was necessarily this time. It's just tough when you let them score on the 2 opening drives. So Notre Dame came out, like you said, looked a little bit rusty, but Louisville totally reinvented themselves in the offseason, and credit to them for being competitive. But obviously Notre Dame was able to separate themselves in the second half. So.
Did any worries start to creep in as Louisville scored those first 2 touchdowns of the game? The defense probably wasn't up to par on those first 2 drives.
I think it was just surprise, to go back to my original point, because a 2-10 team that went 0-8 in the ACC last year and had 5 blowouts to end their season.
Yeah.
You think that you're going to come in and sort of walk all over the
like
Cardinals.
in New Mexico.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that this team is actually going to make a little bit of noise in the ACC. I think that they could win 5 or 6 games and really surprise some people. They have a lot of speed at running back and quarterback. And I was watching them, and it was kind of like a triple option type.
Yes,
that
I thought the same thing. Definitely not something that they anticipated, and obviously you spend weeks preparing for that when you know it's coming against Navy, but when you don't expect it against Louisville and then it appears, I think that's really tough to kind of adjust to. But I do think one positive takeaway from this Notre Dame team was that they were able to adjust in-game, and it didn't take all the way until halftime to make those adjustments. So.
And Ian Book, you mentioned him earlier, David. He was 14 for 23, maybe not quite as good as he was a season ago, at least in the opener, that is. Right. He seemed to be scrambling quite a bit, maybe not relying on his offensive line as much as you may have hoped.
I think to quote Brian Kelly after the game, he was trying to put the weight of the world on his shoulders and maybe felt a little bit too much pressure. I think he settled down well. And again, this is week 1. You look at Trevor Lawrence, he didn't have a great week. He had 2 interceptions. So it's just about shaking the rust off and getting into the swing of things as we're in the early going.
Yeah, and I mean, did you know he had legs? Because I didn't know he had legs.
Right.
But
he
it looks
has
like he had legs.
He does have legs.
I mean, you're not used to Ian Book being your second highest rusher.
Right.
So I think it was different. I think he scrambled early. He didn't spend that much time in the pocket, which was interesting and not something that we're used to seeing from him. But I don't think it was necessarily the wrong call all the time.
He didn't have a bad game by any stretch.
I agree.
14 for 23, 193 yards, a touchdown rushing and a touchdown passing.
Yeah.
I think he just looked a little bit antsy was the word that came to mind for me. He just looked a little bit jumpy, and I think that was characteristic of some other Notre Dame players as well. But I would rather that than him come out slow and flat-footed. He was just on edge, it felt like.
Yeah, well, Ian Book had 14 carries, 81 yards for the Irish. You mentioned, Ellen, the Irish's second leading rusher behind only Tony Jones Jr. He had a huge gain to start the game. It was about 20 yards or so right off the first play of the game. Did that set the tone for the rest of the game for the Irish? How big of a moment was that right off the bat?
I mean, I think it was important, but that clearly wasn't where they kind of emerged as the contender in the game, as the top team. That's not really where they separated themselves. So I think it was important, but since things got so sloppy on defense, I don't think that's where Notre Dame kind of started to build their momentum.
I thought the rushing game was good overall for Book and for the running backs as well, and I think a large part of that was the offensive line, which I know that we want to touch on.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's jump into the running backs first. Tony Jones Jr., 110 yards on 15 carries. It was a big game for him. A season ago, Tony Jones Jr. was up and down, but he definitely shined in week 1.
Yeah, and he looked like a different back. I mean, he definitely cut down a lot this year, and last year we were used to seeing him as sort of a ground and pound guy up the middle, but he seemed quicker and shiftier this year, more of like a Dexter Williams type, because last year you saw Dexter Williams as the speed and Tony Jones sort of as that brute force running back right up the middle. I think that he's now a lot more versatile at running back, and I think we saw that with some runs to the outside and obviously 110 yards on 15 carries. Really
yeah,
good.
I agree, and you don't necessarily have to rely on him only for the dive type plays this season. I do think it hurts that Jafar Armstrong's out again. I mean, now this is 2 years in a row where you think he's going to really come out and be your breakout guy on the ground, and twice in a row he's gotten injured. So hopefully his recovery, won't be as detrimental as it seems like it might be if Tony Jones can fill that void, like you said, David. I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, Jafar Armstrong out for the next 5 weeks of the season. What role does Tony Jones Jr. have to play now that Jafar Armstrong's out?
I'm actually going to highlight another guy. I think Jameer Smith has to come in and be a big running back too, because in college football now it's really not one running back except for a Travis Etienne type at Clemson, but otherwise you're going to see Jones, and I think Jameer Smith is going to get a lot of carries as well. And again, I keep going back to the offensive line, because if they are as good as they were week 1, it's not going to matter who's at running back because the holes were huge.
So let's talk a little bit more about the offensive line. You said it was as good as it's been. How does it compare to last season? A lot of people thought a season ago the offensive line may have actually been one of the weaknesses for the Irish. Is it a strength this year?
I think it is. I'm really impressed with the offense overall. They have more skill position speed at running back and wide receiver. And Book had time to work in the pocket. As I said, I think he was just a little bit antsy working outside of the pocket and maybe getting a little bit jumpy when he felt a little bit of pressure. But I was very impressed with the offensive line. I think that left side, led by Eichenberg, is really solid, and then Kramer and Hainsey on the right.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to note also that it didn't really look like the offensive line was holding that strong at the beginning of the game, but I think that's not necessarily because they weren't holding strong. It was because, like you said, Book was just getting a little antsy in the pocket.
Right.
So I think if he takes a deep breath, calms down, takes the 4 or 5 seconds as opposed to the 1 or 2 before he takes off down the field, I think that highlights what a good job the offensive line is doing.
Yeah.
So.
You talked a little bit about the running backs. You talked a little bit about Ian Book and the offensive line. Let's talk about some of the receivers and the tight ends. First, Claypool. He had a pretty big game, 5 receptions, 94 yards. One of the big question marks for the Irish was how big of a role is Chase Claypool going to play this year? It was a solid start to the season.
Yeah, and Brian Kelly said he was the best player on the field. I mean, that's high praise when your coach says that. To be honest, he didn't jump out at me. 5 receptions for 94 yards. He did what he needed to do. I think the passing game just took a little bit to get going.
I agree, and I think Claypool has to be that guy this year.
Right.
I mean, Book's favorite target was Miles Boykin, and he's not here anymore. So Claypool has those big shoes to fill. I think he did a good job week 1. I think he's going to have to keep it up. He's kind of got the same build as Boykin with the lean. He's tall and he's quick too, but there were just a couple times when Book just missed him, and I think there were some sloppy throws, but that's something that as they get more comfortable playing with each other and Claypool more moves into that role as the first receiver, that's just going to get a little bit better.
Right.
So
We'll jump into the tight ends in a moment, but are there any other wide receivers on this Notre Dame roster who either stood out to you in week 1 or who you think are going to play a big role moving forward?
You want it first? You want me?
go ahead.
I got Lawrence Keys. I like him as a freshman. He's 5'10", 173, very fast. He was a top 150 player out of high school. I think you're going to see him sort of fill in that role and actually maybe split a little bit of time with Fink. You're going to see him in some quick crossing routes and some quick screen passes.
Yeah, the shallower routes.
Yeah, exactly. I really like him, and I think he's got a lot of potential.
Yeah, and that's something Brian Kelly talked about too after the game, is he said the freshmen really stood out week 1 against Louisville, and the role players and the older guys kind of need to take the example from them, the younger guys, which is not something we're used to seeing. But it breaks my heart. My guy would have been Mike Young, but obviously he's out with that collarbone injury. I think that hurts. Chris Fink needs to continue to be a leader. He obviously can't play the same way that Claypool can, just because he doesn't have the size. But Lawrence Keys, I think he's a good sign for what's to come.
I like Braden Lensley too. I don't know how much time he's going to get, but in some of these blowout games, you might see him in the second half, and I think that that's a good opportunity for him to get onto the scene as well.
Yeah.
Talked about some of the younger talent. Let's jump into Tommy Tremble, the tight end. He's a redshirt freshman this year, had a big game in week 1 for the Irish.
I mean, like Brian Kelly said, like I just said too, the younger players were kind of the source of hope for this game. the older guys looked pretty antsy. Ian Book in the pocket, and Claypool was fine, but kind of like you said, Korzo, he didn't stand out to me.
Right.
So I think the younger players are a good sense of hope. I think this team has a lot to build on. Obviously, you lose 6 guys in the draft, and you think you're not going to have a good season. But I think that there's a lot to be hopeful for this year with the new talent.
And I think something characteristic of this year's team, Austin and Ellen, is the depth. Because last year you saw that depth was tested against Clemson when Julian Love went out and all of a sudden the game's over. I think that they have a lot more depth offensively because Brock Wright's a solid tight end. Tommy Tremble did a really good job on that route right up the middle, beat the linebacker, easy throw for Book to make. But we talked about a lot of wide receivers, and then if you add Tremble, Kmet when he's back from his injury, and Brock Wright too, I think you have a lot more options offensively.
We've talked a little bit about Jameer Smith. Let's talk a little more about him. A redshirt freshman. He played in a few games last year, but he still kept that redshirt ability, so he can play a 5th year if he would like. He had a big game in week 1. He had 8 carries, 24 yards. The yards per carry wasn't so great, but he added 2 big touchdowns.
Yeah, and that's always something that's good to see. I think when Jafar Armstrong goes out, you kind of you get a little bit deflated, you lose a little bit of hope, but then when Smith's able to come in and kind of fill those shoes, that's a good sign. And obviously him and Tony Jones were able to kind of be productive on the ground, which is something that at least I didn't necessarily expect with Dexter Williams being gone and Ian Book being such a pass-first quarterback. I thought it was really going to be all about the throw this season, but I think the performance we saw on the ground gives me a lot of hope for the rest of the season with the rushing game.
Yeah, I agree. I think Smith's going to be a big part because I mentioned with Jafar Armstrong's injury.
Let's talk about a defensive player now. Kyle Hamilton, he was Notre Dame's top recruit coming into the season. By all defensive metrics, including the Pro Football Focus ranking, he was an 88.7 overall, which is pretty darn good for that first game against Louisville. Can you guys tell me a little more about what you saw from him?
Yeah, I think he did a good job breaking up the passes in the middle. I think he had 4 unassisted tackles. I think he's just a solid presence, the kind of guy you need in the backfield when your defensive back is a place with question marks. Like you said, in that Clemson game, you didn't really know what was going on with the secondary. So I think he's a good person to step in and kind of lead by example.
Yeah, I thought he stole the show, to be honest with you, defensively. The most important thing for defensive backs is timing. It's getting there and defending right as the pass comes in so you're not getting a pass interference call. And his timing was perfect. He was getting right to the wide receiver as the ball was getting there, jarred it loose, had a couple pass deflections and some tackles as well. I really, really liked what I saw from him.
Let's transition away from Notre Dame now and into some of the other matchups around college football. There's one top 10 matchup. That's number 6 LSU versus number 9 Texas. It should be a pretty good game. LSU had a big win over Georgia Southern in week 1. Texas beat Louisiana Tech in a big win as well. What did you see from each of those 2 teams, and what do you expect for this upcoming matchup this week?
I like Texas personally. I think that it's a battle of the quarterbacks. I think that the quarterback who has a better game, that team's going to win. You got Sam Ehlinger for Texas. He's a star. He was great last year. Joe Burrow for LSU, 278 passing yards and 5 touchdowns in week 1.
Yeah, Ehlinger had 4 too.
Yeah, I like the Longhorns because they're at home. They have a really dynamic offense. Keontae Ingram, their running back, 78 rushing yards week 1. I got the Longhorns in a close game.
Yeah, I think Texas, I like the way they're shaping up this season too, but I think you do have to look at Joe Burrow. Yeah. Him coming in and taking that role at LSU after not getting the starting job at Ohio State. Obviously, you know this is a guy who's hungry. He's ready to prove himself. He's got that starting job now. What's he going to do with it? Right. So I think it's certainly going to be a good game, but for me, I don't know. I just don't really put that much stock in the rankings until later in the season, so it's kind of arbitrary.
So who's your pick? You're going with?
I'll go with LSU. Make things interesting.
All right, Korzo with Texas. Ellen with LSU. Let's move on to another game. Not quite a top 10 matchup, but basically it is. Number 1 Clemson against number 12 Texas A&M. To say that Clemson had a letdown in week 1 with Trevor Lawrence would probably be an understatement. Trevor Lawrence, 13 for 23, 168 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. This was not the Trevor Lawrence we saw at the end of the season that won the national championship.
Yeah, but it's kind of like what we were saying about Notre Dame. You just got to get out there, shake the rust off. I mean, he's a college kid. I think you put him in these high-pressure situations. Obviously, he can perform. But when it's week 1, it doesn't really matter. I think it's fine. It's fine if the offense has some kinks that it needs to work out.
I think Clemson's going to win this game pretty easily. I think Texas A&M isn't exactly where they want to be. I know that they're 12 in the preseason rankings and 12 right now, but Clemson is just – their weapons
They're
are
Clemson.
insane, right? You got Etienne, who ran for 205 yards, had a 90-yard touchdown run. T. Higgins, 98 yards versus Georgia Tech. Trevor Lawrence didn't have to be that great against Georgia Tech for them to win by 50.
And that's the thing about teams like Clemson is when your quarterback's not that good, you still have guys like Etienne.
And Clemson is such a good team at home. They won 7 of their home games last year by at least 3 touchdowns. I think that they'll win by 2 touchdowns against Texas A&M.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Texas A&M before we move on. Kellen Mond, their starting quarterback, he had 3 touchdowns in week 1. They had 2 running backs who each put up more than 100 yards, Isaiah Spiller and Josh Corbin. Do you see any of them playing a big enough role to at least give Clemson a test this week?
I think it'll be close for the first quarter, maybe into the second, but I think that Clemson's just going to run away with it at the end. Their offensive line is so good too. I just think defensively, Texas A&M isn't strong enough. They have one defensive back who's very solid, Ronnie Elam, 5 tackles, 2 passes deflected, and an interception in week 1. You'll probably see him go up against T. Higgins, but the amount of weapons that Clemson has, I think, is going to be too much.
Yeah, and I think we do this every year, and we do it every week, and we say, oh, Clemson, oh, they're playing a ranked opponent, oh, is it going to be close? And it's never close. Clemson and Alabama, I think, are the 2 teams you can count on to always blow their opponents out of the water, and I don't think trap games exist for them, so I think they should be fine.
David, do you have another game you want to touch on here before we move on?
Circle your calendars, set the DVR, Army versus Michigan. Okay, people are sleeping on this Army team that was in the top 25 last year. They won 11 games, went 11-2, and then they were in the Armed Forces Bowl. They won 70-14 against Houston.
Whew.
Do you remember that game, week 4, when they played Oklahoma and went to overtime against Oklahoma, who then made the playoff? This is a very solid Army team. They have a dual-threat quarterback with Kevin Hopkins Jr. I don't know if they win. I think they give Michigan a test at the Big House.
Run for their money.
I do. I really do.
I like that prediction because I always want to see Michigan give it a run there.
Yeah, no bias here, but seriously though, the Black Knights are a very good team.
Yeah.
Top 25 last year. No one's talking about them, but I think that they're going to give Michigan a run for their money.
I want to talk about one more game from last week. It's the Georgia versus Vanderbilt game. And Georgia, they were okay. They came home with a win by more than 20 points. Jake Fromm Jake Fromm wasn't terrific. He was 15 for 23, had 156 yards and a touchdown. What did you see from the Georgia Bulldogs? They're only 2 weeks away on Notre Dame's schedule.
I think with Fromm, like we're seeing a theme here with some of the best college quarterbacks, not great in week 1. They're sort of getting into form. This Georgia team is scary, man. They won by 24 points. Their running game is what scares me, and their offensive line is insane. 328 pounds is their average weight on the offensive line. The NFL average is 314.
Woo.
Wow.
So that Georgia offensive line is bigger than most NFL rosters.
Oh, dear.
Their right tackle, Isaiah Wilson, might be injured. They think that he'll be back for the Notre Dame game. But I think DeAndre Swift and that offensive line are what I would be worried about more if I'm Notre Dame than Jake Fromm.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the name of the game. And the Georgia-Notre Dame game is one of those ones you circle on your calendar and you say, oh, it's going to be a great game. But when Notre Dame can't even win here 2 years ago.
I don't know. I am nervous. I think that those nerves and the jumpiness that you saw against Louisville, if that was happening in Louisville, what's it going to be like down in Georgia? They really have to make sure that they are composed. If you're Notre Dame, you can't afford any penalties, and Ian Book has to settle
we haven't
out.
even touched on that yet. 4 for 20 on the penalties at Louisville. So what's that going to translate to?
I didn't think the penalties were too bad, to just go back to Louisville quickly, but I think the defensive line was a little bit jumpy. They were eager to get the jump and get the sack. But they have to calm, cool, and collected against Georgia if they want any chance.
Georgia did lose their top wide receiver before the season. Jeremiah Holloman was dismissed from the football team. He was their top wide receiver a year ago. Coming back this season, was supposed to play a big role. How much does that hurt the Bulldogs?
I think it hurts them a lot, definitely. And I think that they rely on DeAndre Swift even more. I really like that running back and that offensive line, just to go back to that. But Fromm, he came into Notre Dame. It was his first collegiate start against Notre Dame. And he looked great. He's had 2 years to mature, and he's going up at home. I don't think it's kind of an SEC-style offense, something like you see in Louisville or in LSU, excuse me. The quarterbacks don't have to do too much, but he just has to be good enough, and I think he's got a good chance.
Yeah, and it's kind of like what we were saying with Clemson. If Trevor Lawrence doesn't perform, they've got other guys that can pick up the pieces. I think the same is true with Georgia. If Jake Fromm's not there,
Definitely.
they have other guys who can fill that role because they're a deep enough team.
Georgia came to Notre Dame 2 years ago. They brought a big crowd along with them. That played a pretty big role in the matchup, to be honest. Notre Dame going to bring that same crowd? They're going to be able to compete down in Georgia?
Notre Dame Stadium was half red.
It was.
That game.
It was.
I don't know.
Short answer to your question is no.
No.
They're not going to be doing that. I don't know. I look at that matchup, and Georgia fans and the fans, south of the Mason-Dixon line, they're another breed. I mean, they were they were bringing buses up to South Bend. I can't even get a ticket. I've gone online to try to get a ticket. It's like $1,500 bucks. It's going to wipe out my bank account.
Yeah.
So I think only the richest of rich Notre Dame alums will be there. And call it a hunch, I don't think the richest of rich alums are the loud fans.
Yeah.
The wine and cheese crowd, as
I
they
think
call
that's
it.
a valid point.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's a tough road environment to go into. I think Notre Dame's got an uphill battle with that one, but yeah. I like how you have here, Corzo. DeAndre Swift is insane.
He is
insane. So I think if you take one thing away from this show, just take that.
He's nuts.
Well, we talked a little bit about Georgia and Notre Dame. Let's jump into Notre Dame's schedule as a whole. There are a few trap games that definitely play a role, and I honestly think, from my perspective, they surround that Georgia game. The New Mexico game right before the Georgia game, I think a lot of people are going to overlook that because, frankly, New Mexico was bad last season. They took home a win in week 1. Does Notre Dame potentially overlook New Mexico completely? And is this a game in the first half, maybe?
It's not a trap game.
I don't think it's a trap game either. No.
I can't even find a way to entertain that idea. I think you have trap games every season. This is not going to be one.
I like your point, though. I think Notre Dame's trap game this season is Virginia.
Okay, yeah, that was what I was getting at next.
I agree with you, Austin. I think that's a really good take because they're going to play Georgia. It's going to be their biggest game of the year, bigger than Michigan. It's going to take a lot out of them, one way or the other. If they win, it's going to be a huge emotional high that they'll have to bounce back from. If they lose, all of a sudden you're going to pick up the pieces and try to get back to winning ways against UVA. It's a team that beat Pittsburgh 30-14. They hadn't won there ever. They hadn't beaten Pittsburgh since 2014. It's a solid Panthers team as well. They're a very clean team. +2 in the turnover margin, only 3 penalties against the Panthers. I think that they are not going to beat themselves. Notre Dame is going to have to come out and play a good game against the Cavaliers.
Yeah, and also if you think about that Pittsburgh team that Notre Dame almost lost to last year.
It's a good Pittsburgh team.
Yeah. I think for me the trap game is that the end of the season, Stanford. When you're traveling to Stanford, I think they're 23rd right now. I think Notre Dame tends to kind of overlook the back half of the season. They get so excited. I mean, it happened with Josh Adams.
Well, November has always been trouble for Brian Kelly.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be.
I think it was maybe 2015 when they started the season 6-0 and finished something like 8-4.
Yeah, that was 14. Yeah, 14.
So I think, I don't know. For me, that's a trap game. But honestly, I think Virginia Tech, Navy, even any of those games against traditionally strong programs, you have to go in with the right mentality.
Yeah.
Well, clearly the biggest game of the season is Georgia. There's no doubt about that. But let's move maybe a little past that, just the trap games and the Georgia game. What's the second biggest game on Notre Dame's schedule? Is that Michigan? Is it close?
Sure. No, Michigan.
I don't think it's close. I still think Michigan's overrated this year. I don't think they're a top 10
agree.
team.
Yes.
They had a lot of defensive pieces that they lost. Chase Winovich, Rashawn Gary. Those are just a couple. Their defense is not that strong. And again, I go back to that Army game. I think that they could be tested this weekend. I think that they could lose 3 or 4 games this year. I do, but you look at the other games. It's sort of process of elimination for me. So Georgia's number 1. Who's number 2? USC. JT Daniels just got injured.
Yeah.
Probably not. Who else do they play? Ranked opponents. Stanford, maybe. But I think that big game at Michigan, first time at the Big House in a long time. That's got to be your number 2 game.
I agree, and if you just think about the way that everything shaped around that game last year, opening game, college game day, night game, when Notre Dame played Michigan here, that really kind of propelled them, I think, through the first part of the season. So.
And the rivalry is alive and well. I mean, those two teams do not like each other at all.
Yeah.
One last thing here. How good do the Irish have to be to make the college football playoff?
Undefeated.
Undefeated?
They need to be undefeated.
Yeah.
Can they make it with a loss against Georgia?
No, I don't
Absolutely
think so.
not.
I think that the problem is that they don't have that same strength of schedule that they did last year. Last year, they might have been able to afford a win because their schedule was so daunting.
Afford a loss.
This year, if they lose one game, I think they're out.
Yeah.
All right, that'll do it for us here with Shamrock Sports, but stay tuned because Inside the Irish is next at 3:30, where we take a look inside volleyball, soccer, golf, and more.
Cross country even, I think.
All night, babe, make me wanna say la 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 la.